rise for the gospel. In John's gospel, the miracles of Jesus are called signs because they reveal the true character of God. As such, they remain within the mystery of God and cannot be brought under human control. A reading from John chapter 6. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Go ahead.
Any children who are joining us today, you're welcome to join us back in the classrooms. We're going to do a short craft during the sermon. So.
Can I come?
You can come.
Sisters and brothers in faith, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, it's been a quiet week in Red Rock City, my hometown, out there on the edge of the Iron Range. It's been beautiful, the kind of weather that Red Rockers live for. Canadian high pressure blew in and blew out all that hot, humid July air. Folks turned off the air conditioners and opened up the windows for a change. They even spent time outside on their decks laughing with people and having a good time, or some of them even strolling hand in hand down the streets downtown. All except for the Red Rock hospitality team. They didn't have any time last week to stroll around downtown. Hjalmar Eriksson passed away. You know Hjalmar, the last charter member of Red Rock Lutheran. 93 years he's been a member. He's been the wise old patriarch of the church for longer than anyone can remember. And his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they all came in from out of town, and they expected it to be a fairly large funeral, so they set up the dining hall for 100 people, and they bought enough groceries to feed 150 just in case. Well, it turns out Hjalmar had one more surprise up his sleeve. He was not just the charter member of Red Rock Lutheran. Hjalmar was also one of the founding members of Thor's Thunder Motorcycle Club And all of a sudden, a half hour before the funeral, dozens of people rumbled in on custom-made cycles fitted with pre-war Saab two-cycle engines and sidecars painted yellow and blue like the Swedish flag, and ABBA music blaring from the CD players. They parked their bikes in a line by the curb right behind the hearse. There was a whole line of them. It was beautiful. I mean, who knew? Who knew? You think you know a man who's been around for over 90 years, but even Hjalmar's family had no idea. Although Hjalmar's great-grandchildren were suddenly very impressed with their great-grandpa. 250 people showed up for that funeral. 250. The ushers, they counted the people in the church, and they ran to the kitchen to tell the hospitality team, and immediately 2 servers began cutting all the bars in half. 2 others quick went to Red Rock Grocery to buy up all the pickled herring and potato salad that they had, plus several loaves of bread and meat and cheese, and plus 5 jars of pickles. They got back to the church just as the mourners were beginning to go through the serving line. And so while 2 people served, the others made sandwiches and spooned potato salad into serving bowls and pickles and herring onto relish trays. They managed to just keep ahead of the crowd so that everybody was fed in an orderly manner. And all the mourners, they expressed their sympathy to the family. They told funny stories about Hjalmar, and nobody but the servers noticed the miracle of the meal that took place right under their noses. There were a lot of meals served last week, by the way, not at the church, but all around town. Last week was Red Rock's annual pickaxe party, 3 days of bike races and carnival rides and games of skill and cotton candy down in the park, a softball tournament at the ball field, and of course, well, you got to have a parade, right? And the kickoff for Red Rock Pickaxe Party is always the Thursday evening breaded fish dinner served at Red Rock Bank. Free meal. The whole community comes. And the whole staff is decked out in maroon Red Rock Bank aprons. And Grant Fritchie, the president of the bank, is always out in the parking lot frying fish along with all the loan officers right next to him. And his daughter Carla and all the tellers are next to them plating the fish and throwing on a handful of fries, a buttered dinner roll, ketchup, and tartar sauce. And nobody can believe how these few people serve the whole town every year, but they do it every year. It started a little over 25 years ago, the year Kurt and Carla had their first baby. There were some complications. They rushed little Sarah down to Children's Hospital in the cities, and she needed several surgeries and procedures, and even then there were no guarantees. And Grant was down there, of course, with his daughter during most of the spring and summer that year. And every day at the hospital was a roller coaster ride of hope and disappointment and prayers and hope again. And finally, that July, little Sarah was strong enough to come home. It was July 24th. They called it her birthday. And the next day, just before closing, the president of the bank called Grant into his office. Grant was a loan officer then. He said, "I need you tomorrow at 11 o'clock. He said it in that gruff voice that he always used that intimidated everybody. And he said, "I know it's Saturday, but we have to catch up on all that paperwork we got behind on when you were gone. So be here." "Yes, sir," Grant said. And he returned to work promptly at 11 the next day. He opened the door, turned on the lights, and suddenly hundreds of people leapt up and yelled, "Surprise!" "What?" I mean, after his heart started again, Grant said, "What? It's not my birthday." "No, Grant, it's not your birthday," the president said. "This day is about your granddaughter and your family. And this day is a benefit for little Sarah." And with that began a silent auction and a community fish fry and a dunk tank and games of chance and all sorts of activities designed to help everybody have a good time and to raise money for the Fritchies' medical bills. And by the time the day was over, they had raised over $15,000. Grant saw people he hadn't seen since high school, and all of Kurt and Carla's friends were there, and hundreds of people were there that Grant and Kurt and Carla had never seen before. I mean, who knew? Who knew people could be so generous to folks they didn't even know. And after all the stress and the loneliness at the hospital, it was just overwhelming. Grant never ate. He never sat down until it was all over. And at the end of the day, when everyone left, the cooks gave him one of the 12 take-home boxes of leftover fish and chips. When Grant got home, he turned on the light and put the fish and chips into the microwave. After a minute, he took them out, and then he slumped down into his kitchen chair. He opened the fish and chips. He picked up a piece of bread, said a quick prayer of thanks, and broke it. And suddenly, his eyes were filled with tears. How could a little bread and a little fish save his family from financial ruin? His community gathered around him. They let him know that he was not alone in this fight. They were right beside him all along. And it was as if all his prayers had been answered, and he had been taken safe through the storm. He looked at the bread in his hand, the fish. He tasted it. And in it, he could taste the mercy of God. And he realized how his Lord had given him everything of value in his life. His daughter, his granddaughter, great medical care, all these people. Gifts that all the money in the world could never buy. And he would never forget that. Never. Never. The next year, Grant and his daughter sponsored the first annual Red Rock Pickaxe Party breaded fish dinner. And they served everybody who came. It was a service of thankfulness for the community's love, but mostly for Grant, it was the taste of bread and fish that reminded him of his Lord. How do you thank someone who's given you everything of value in your whole life? And every year since, folks come from miles around for a free meal of breaded fish at Red Rock Bank. And the fish is excellent, the conversation's even better. And some people, like Grant, they even taste the presence of the giver in, with, and under the bread and fish. The one who feeds a multitude, the one who hears the desperate prayers of young parents and heals little babies in ICU, the one who stills the storm and gets us through to the other side, the giver of every good gift, the best gift of all. And that's the news from Red Rock City, where the Roman Catholics are strong, the Methodists are good-looking, and the Baptists are above average. Please stand for the